Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you very much for this discussion of a special issue, which was published this year just recently with Nationalities Papers, called Internationalism in Times of Nationalism, Yugoslavia, Nonalignment, and the Cold War. It's a special issue which has been the product of a number of years, which was first to a large degree based on papers which were discussed in Graz in a joint workshop with Exeter, University of Exeter, and we have here Ljubica, Spaskovska, and James Mark, who will be presenting and representing the Exeter side of this particular initiative we had. We had this workshop a few years ago where all of the papers, or most of the papers, in fact, I should say, most of the papers were presented. And then afterwards, we took a number of years to work on them and develop them. And so we are very glad that it came to fruition and was published just a few months ago with Nationalities Papers. So to kick us off into our conversation and presentation, first of all, I'm going to hand the floor to Ljubica to present a little bit the framework and how we conceptualized the background to this special issue. Ljubica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you everyone for being here today. Thanks a lot to Tvrtko Jakovina, who agreed to provide the commentary today as well. So as Florian mentioned, this grew out of a conference that took place in Graz 5 years ago. Again, a lot of these contributors presented at the time. We also had Tvrtko, and notably we also had Mr. Budimir Lončar with us at the time. It was also a sort of a round anniversary at the time of the non-aligned movement, but of course this year we also have a big anniversary, so this can be also seen as a small contribution towards remembering as well the non-aligned movement through an academic and more critical lens. So what we were trying to achieve through this special issue is really interrogate those binary typologies that are often used to characterize the period of the global Cold War. We argued that, and a lot of the papers had a similar argument, that non-alignment needs to be read as part of a longer-term 20th century of internationalism. Now, of course, some of the papers and my own research as well is trying to trace both the rise and decline of this history of progressive, let's say, progressive leftist internationalism. And especially for myself, having worked on how applying a generational lens in a way can sometimes enrich our understanding of both Yugoslav and global history. For me, it was very interesting to see in Milorad's papers, but also in several others, how the departure of the partisan generation also shaped or changed the non-alignment as such, especially in the 1980s. So for this generation, right, it was through their involvement and support of other liberation movements in the global South, this Yugoslav leader, this people whose political socialization also coincided with events like the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War, most notably, they recaptured their finest hours, as Rubinstein also has argued, through their involvement in other liberation struggles in the Cold War. So here, Milorad will speak a little bit more, but I think our special issue makes a contribution in that sense that we also add that generational lens to a certain extent. Also, I think what the papers are trying to achieve is to demonstrate the multi-layered meanings and practices of non-alignment, and the fact that non-alignment meant different things to different actors. So the papers look at indeed how different actors negotiated in the framework of non-alignment. They negotiate their own spaces, their own priorities as well. And again, that we try to capture that shift that occurred in the 1980s, both through the generational shifts that occurred, but also through the so-called quote-unquote neoliberal turn, and how a lot of these aspects of non-alignment and these solidarities both declined, but also were, as I said, renegotiated or took on a more commercial features and characteristics. So I will stop here. These are some of the big points I wanted to highlight, and I'm sure the authors will mention other important aspects as well.
Great, thanks a lot, Ljubica. So James, please, the floor is yours to also kind of provide a larger conceptualization of where this special issue in a certain way fits into also a larger research agenda.
Well, I will try. Well, thank you, everyone. It's nice to see so many people here. And indeed, it's nice to see the people who I met and discussed these issues with in Graz. It's been some time, but it's great to see the special issue out. I just briefly wanted to say this was also part of a broader project, 1989, Rethinking the Fall of State Socialism in Global Perspective, of which Ljubica and I were a part. And one of its central concerns was to think about deprovincializing, if you want, the story of the region's transformation, and indeed how to explore how 1989 was not the kind of first important moment of globalization, with the region's ambiguous incorporation into Euro-Atlantic capitalism, but rather the region had taken part in multiple world-making projects, and the transition was more complex because of that. And that indeed, in some ways, the collapse of state socialism in many ways represented the moment of deglobalization as much as new forms of it. Obviously, a central part of that was Ljubica's project, which she partly described today, and also that led us to this collaboration with Graz and with all of you to look at questions of non-alignment. And of course, one of the central themes was that post-war decolonization in Africa and Asia played a massive role in the acceleration of economic and cultural and other forms of globalization. If we want to use that term, it's problematic in lots of ways, whether in terms of bloc internationalism or whether in terms of its non-aligned variety. And I think one of the strengths of the collection is really showing the range of spheres in which that form of internationalism, world-making took place, from museums to women's activism to the military and so on. And that also a lot of it was made from the bottom up. It had to work within state structures, it had to negotiate with them, but this was a complex process. The second point I want to make, I think, picks up on one of Ljubica's, which is that this worlding of Yugoslavia, or the region around it more broadly, through decolonization, set the stage for this transition to a more Western-dominated globalization. In this sense, it gives us quite a different perspective on transition and the forms of complex renegotiations that took place in the 1980s. But in many ways, non-alignment or solidarity was the basis for relationships which had to be renegotiated in a world that was now shaped by capital flows, by debt, and so on. But we have to look at the complex interrelationship of those processes. A third question we might well open out a discussion about today is the question of why is this relevant? Why does this remain relevant? Of course, Ljubica makes the important point about broader histories of internationalism and how we write them. We also might think about contemporary relevance too. And I suppose over the last decade, these sorts of stories have seemed much less part of a kind of lost world that has gone forever, but rather inform all sorts of new political formations, alliances. On one hand, we have the global financial crisis since 2008 and the development of populisms, often of a right-wing variety, who are looking for new forms of relationships beyond a liberal West. And in so doing, again, renegotiating, or in some places rediscovering forms of relationship from this earlier period. And I also think the forms of resistance to these new populist forms are also seeing new forms of interconnection, and particularly trying to break down this division between kind of the post-socialist and post-colonial worlds and thinking about what brings them together. And I've just been actually at a really interesting online talk for a book on post-colonial and post-socialist dialogues from the point of view of feminist movements. And exactly, they're thinking about breaking down some of these categories and thinking about the collective experience of right-wing populisms and resistances to them in post-colonial and post-socialist worlds. So I'd very much welcome too a discussion about the roles of these sorts of histories in the contemporary world. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot. And so we're basically going to give every author a chance to briefly introduce their main arguments. Of course, you all have to read the special issue to really get the full gist of it and the richness of the materials presented in there. And then afterwards, Tvrtko Jakovina will be providing some comments, and then you'll have a chance to ask your questions. You can, of course, already put them in the chat if you want, if you're inspired by any of the presentations. So we're going to go in the order of the articles as they are published. And so we're going to go first with an article which is jointly written by Ljubica as well as by Anna Calori, who is currently a fellow at the Imre Kertész Center in Jena, if I'm not mistaken. So, so Anna, please go ahead. I think you'll be introducing that article for the both of you.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you, Ljubica, for organizing this event and, well, the past conference that brought us all together. I'm going to cheekily say that no one has aged in the past 5 years, as I can see from the videos, so it's excellent to see you all in great shape. So I will be introducing the article that Ljubica and I co-authored, and which connects me to her point about the multi-layeredness of non-alignment. So in this article, we look at the role of Yugoslavia's global socialist enterprises in giving shape to what we define as a non-aligned business world. So a set of economic entanglements and exchanges that emerged within the non-aligned sphere. So we map the geographical reach of these global socialist enterprises, firmly placed at the center of a web of economic exchanges between the global South, Western Europe, and the Soviet bloc. They were crucial to boost Yugoslavia's foreign trade and hard currency revenue, and at the same time were crucial for domestic industrial development. So our focus is on the entanglements between less developed semi-peripheral countries, and that is why we focus on Yugoslavia's very own semi-periphery less developed ones, so Bosnia and Macedonia, and their export-oriented companies that had business ventures in many developing countries from Egypt to Iraq to Cuba and Pakistan. So we show that these enterprises put in practice Yugoslavia's approach to equitable development by providing economic and technical cooperation to developing partners. And we highlight that this was part of Yugoslavia's vision for a democratization of international economic relations, one that would be more attentive indeed to the existing imbalances between North and South developed and developing countries. The global integration of Yugoslav self-managed enterprises, however, did not only manifest itself through these trade relations or business partnerships. As we show, it was also embedded in a transnational exchange of ideas around development, management, trade, and interdependence. And so the non-aligned business world was also conducive of a growing interest and research at the international level around the public enterprise and its management, a debate in which Yugoslavia actually featured prominently, not only as a subject of study, but also as a knowledge producer. And we bring the example, for example, of a company in Bosnia that engaged with the American advisors at McKinsey as a way to combine Western models of management, pricing, and production on one hand with a domestic model of industrial democracy and worker self-management on the other. Finally, Ljubica and I have a passion for the human stories behind these exchanges. So in the last part of the article, we actually looked at the global socialist enterprise at home. And we collected interviews with employees that show a sense of geopolitical pride as well as concrete welfare and social mobility opportunities that people associate with the employment in these global companies. And I like to think that our paper paves the way for two interesting developments. Going in the direction of business history, one could look more closely at the contours and dynamics of this non-aligned business world beyond the case of Yugoslavia. And indeed at the challenges that arose for these small players in a global economy that was increasingly overpowered by large transnational corporations. The second path is more from the bottom up. So what kind of mobilities, relationships, emotions, and expectations emerge through these exchanges? And do we see actually different alternative notions of, for example, entrepreneurship or labor regimes in these contexts? The question here, for example, of racial hierarchies might be one, but certainly not the only possible angle to explore this. And finally, what I'm mostly interested in is what are the afterlives of these connections after 1991. And just to briefly conclude, I think beyond the content of the article, I would like to spend a couple of words on the process of writing it. Co-writing is always tough, but actually very rewarding exercise, I find. And I think it gave us the possibility to compare our sources, extend the breadth of our analysis, and be able to actually zoom in and out from the particular of shop floor talk to the general of international debates in a way that I think is quite effective for our analysis. So this was a great exercise and experience. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot, Anna, for giving us this overview. And now we'll turn to Milorad Lazic, who is a lecturer at the George Washington University and at the US Naval Academy, and who's looked in particular at, in fact, the arms trade or the business in a certain way, the business of solidarity. I'm sorry, that was in fact the arms dimension of the trade with the non-aligned movement, and whether business or other consideration trumped that relationship. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Florian, for this kind introduction, and also thank you for picking up my paper at ACES 2017. So I wasn't a part of this grad group, but I'm very honored to be included in this volume. And also thank you, Ljubica and James, for putting it together, and Tvrtko for your comments. As Florian says, my paper is about what I term as Yugoslav military internationalism, which is basically a set of programs of military assistance to various liberation movements and revolutionary regimes during the Cold War. And what I argue in my paper is that Yugoslav military internationalism encompassed different economic, political, ideological, security, and cultural practices. My list is pretty long, but I'll try to explain it and how it ties to other articles in this volume. I also argue that these programs, we cannot just look through this increasingly economic lens that Yugoslav companies, most notably SDPR, Yugo Import, which was this chief state-owned company that was in charge of this arms sales business. We should look at them through different aspects of military internationalism. Number one, these programs underscored international solidarity that the regime in Belgrade tried to establish, especially after this Yugoslav-Soviet split in 1948. They also showcased the achievements of Yugoslavia's modernization efforts, which is something that you can easily see in these documents that I used, that policymakers, leaders of these companies or organizations who were involved in these efforts to assist or even sell weapons to liberation movement and revolutionary regimes always underline this point that achievements of Yugoslav military-industrial complex were very important as a foothold to expanding economic cooperation with these countries in the global south. In addition to these political and economic motives, and I'm trying to emphasize this point, it also demonstrated, and Ljubica will probably have more to say about it, this emotional identification of Yugoslav greatest generation, those who participated in the World War II or Spanish Civil War, with these revolutions abroad, because you can see that participants, but also contemporaries often commented how Yugoslav military involvement in the global south is almost like a reliving of Yugoslav revolution over and over again for these who were involved in those enterprises. Also, to go back to some of the points in introduction, by late 1970s, with generational change, when this generation who experienced this revolutionary turmoil and directly participated in, for example, Spanish Civil War or World War II struggle in Yugoslavia, was either marginalized in political sense or died, but also with structural changes in the global Cold War, not just economic changes in 1980s with the global debt crisis, but also successful end of decolonization struggle, at least its armed part, where by the 1980s, the only remained part that was still waiting for liberation was South Africa. These programs became increasingly motivated by economic interest. That economic interest prevailed in this last phase. One of the points I wanted to make by discussing this arms deals and military assistance in the 1980s is that it outlived Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia fell apart in 1991, many of these programs that were established way back in 1950s and 1960s and 70s, they continued in somewhat different forms by these very frequent armed deals between military-industrial complexes of Yugoslav successor states with different regimes and movements abroad. I will stop here with this as a conclusion, but I look forward to continuing this discussion in Q&As. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So next, from the arms business to women's solidarity. So that's a jump, but shows you also the scope of our special issues. So we have Chiara Bonfiglioli, who is a lecturer of gender studies at University College Cork, and she will be presenting her research. Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, Ljubica and James as well for this great special issue. It's a pleasure to see you again after the conference in Graz. So in my article, I look at something that's generally overlooked, which is women's side of non-aligned internationalism. As we know, internationalism during the non-aligned movement is generally presented as a male affair, so to say. And in this article, I retrace the history of women's cross-border internationalist connection within the non-aligned movement, focusing on the exchanges between women's organizations in Yugoslavia and women's organizations in the global south, particularly India, during the 1950s and 1960s, but also during the UN Decade for Women from 1975 to 1995. And as we know, as a result of the Soviet-Yugoslav split of 1948, Yugoslavia was expelled from the Women's International Democratic Federation, or WIDF, which is considered the main organization for anti-fascist, communist, and socialist women up until 1989. To overcome such isolation after this expulsion, Yugoslav representatives strive to establish their own bilateral connection, especially with women's organizations in the global south, following the general policy of Yugoslavia on non-alignment. So what I did in the article in the first part was to look at the connection established by the Union of Women's Alliances and the Conference for the Social Activity of Women at the heyday of non-alignment in the 1950s and 1960s. And then for the subsequent period, the 1970s and 1980s, I looked at the UN Decade for Women and at Yugoslav women's activism through the lens of Vida Tomšić activism. Vida Tomšić was a former partisan, a leading politician. She was trained as a lawyer in Slovenia, and she had a fundamental role both in non-aligned and UN settings and in formulating conceptions of gender and development. And this conception that she formulated, they had a resonance not just in Yugoslavia, but also in the global south. So in the article, what I do is to analyze Vida Tomšić's correspondence with Indian women, Indian activists and Indian women's organization. And I also look at her travels, which started already in the 50s when she first visited India and then continued until the late 1980s. And I especially looked at the connection that she had with Indian scholar and women's studies pioneer Veena Mazumdar. as they call themselves, Vina and Vida, they amicably address each other in this correspondence, which is contained in the Vida Tomšić collection in the archives in Slovenia. And they somehow discussed how to best lobby for a new international economic order at UN women's conferences, but also at conferences organized within the non-aligned movement on the issue of women's emancipation. So there is a parallel activism within the non-aligned movement that follows this UN women's conferences in 1975, 85, 85, and there's this kind of parallel lobbying there in connection with UN meetings. So my article tries to expand this literature on East-South connection, which has been recently revived by a number of scholars, and also looks at this issue of the UN decade from a comparative perspective. That's something that also came up recently in the scholarship. There was a very successful workshop a month ago organized by Natalia Jarska at University Complutense in Madrid, and there were all these different perspectives on the UN decade for women from a transnational perspective, so East, South, and West, of course. And as Christine Gozzi and other scholars have noted, the East-South Alliance and the lobbying for a new international economic order during the UN decade for women had a crucial role, especially at the Mexico City conference. It kind of faded away with the crisis in the socialist world and the global South in the 80s. And then if we look at the Beijing conference in 1995, the role of State Socialist Women's Organization disappeared, so much so that this women's organization issued the statement of the non-region because they felt so left out from this Beijing conference, which was focusing very much on this West-South connection. So that's something to keep in mind, what happened with this legacy, where these archives go. Many of these archives are either inaccessible or destroyed. We're lucky to have this great collection in Ljubljana that was left by Vida Tomšić. So that's something that I try to look at in the article. And of course, there will be much more to say, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks a lot, Chiara. So let's go to Peter Wright, who is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And he's looked at in a certain way, commercial relations, or how development assistance became more commercialized, and also in the level of higher education. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. I also want to thank Ljubica, James, and of course Florian for organizing this roundtable and the original conference. It's been an honor to be included alongside such brilliant scholars in this new research direction. So my article is centered around what I think is a rather straightforward plot. From the early 1970s, individual republic leaderships and institutions of higher education in Yugoslavia gradually became much more interested in and invested in fee-paying international students, as opposed to the costlier scholarship students that the Yugoslav state had supported since the mid-1950s. So faculties primarily in SR Croatia and SR Serbia began actively recruiting self-financing international students and charging them ever higher tuition prices and other fees. In the early 1980s, the number of these self-financing students in Yugoslavia skyrocketed, and according to some estimates, made up approximately 5% of all university students in Yugoslavia. So while this development generated a lot of revenue, it proved to be risky and short-lived, as this market for international students in Yugoslavia went elsewhere in the late 1980s, after 1987. In the end, the enthusiasm for international student tuition money priced out international scholarship students, of whom the majority by the 1980s were from sub-Saharan Africa. These scholarship students became fewer and fewer, both in real numbers and in proportional terms over the course of the 1980s. So the bulk of my article backtracks from this point in the mid-1980s, this collapse of international student market in Yugoslavia, to show how commercializing tendencies in higher education, specifically international higher education, affected Yugoslavia and the state scholarship program for students from the global South. I also detail the anxieties of Yugoslav managers at Zamtes, which is the the Agency for International Technical Cooperation, regarding the difficulties of balancing between political and profit-based priorities. So situating this research about higher education in Yugoslavia in as broad an international context as possible is one way to that I use to avoid pathologizing Yugoslavia or socialism, or perpetuating entrenched declensionist narratives about the state and non-alignment. In the end, I argue that it was not primarily some nebulous crisis of non-aligned politics in the 1980s or the dissolution of the Yugoslav state that eroded Yugoslavia's scholarship program, but rather a combination of domestic and international factors, such as global changes in thinking and policies regarding development, education, and organizational management, the politics of debt, market integration and profit-seeking behavior in Yugoslavia that displaced a commitment to political priorities, decentralization, of course, and larger structural and institutional developments, such as the rise of the World Bank in education planning and its influence in UNESCO. So just to conclude, my attempt to place this well-known topic of international students in Yugoslavia in a broader global and institutional context has a few important implications. So traditionally, scholars have written about international students and the scholarship program in Yugoslavia through the lens of solidarity politics and the non-aligned movement. This can sometimes dislocate what happened in Yugoslavia from the broader historical phenomenon of post-war student migration from the global south and the structural changes that I've discussed in international student education, namely commercializing tendencies. And most of the existing literature on international students in Yugoslavia also focuses on the 1950s and 1960s, this heyday of non-aligned solidarity. Whereas I've placed an emphasis on the late socialist period of the 1980s to see how trends of technocracy, decentralization, and market integration affected this really prominent initiative of Yugoslav non-aligned policy. In terms of questions that I would pose, I have mostly self-reflective or self-critical ones about understandings of commercialism. And I've appreciated how Ljubica and Anna here and elsewhere have talked about how Yugoslav workers reconciled profit-seeking, socialism, and non-alignment in their work abroad. On the other hand, the records I've consulted with Zamtes and Sieve collections, there is this consistent concern about the apparent conflict about profit-seeking or commercialization and the political priorities of non-alignment that perhaps an older generation of Yugoslavs saw slipping away. And this is mostly connected to the allocation of resources. So the incongruence between investment, increasing investment in petrostates like Libya, Iraq, Nigeria, that left fewer resources for countries with fewer means, such as those in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere. So I think I'm over my time. I'll end there. And thank you once again.
Great, thanks, Peter. And I think this is one of the themes we'll probably pick up on also later. So next I'll go to Mila Turajlic, who is an independent filmmaker and has also been conducting extensive research about the topic she's wrote an article about, which is exactly about documentary film diplomacy in the context of the non-aligned movement. So Mila, the floor is yours. Now, I don't see her at the moment, so it seems like she might have dropped out. She was here. So I think that while we're waiting for her to reconnect, we're just going to give the floor to Bojana Videkanic, who is an associate professor of contemporary art and visual culture at the University of Waterloo, Canada. Now, Mila is back. So if Mila is back, then I'll give the floor to Mila, but I've already introduced Bojana, who will present right after her. So Mila, the floor is yours, and we'll hear about the documentary. And you can also share a screen if you want to do so. You can do that. Go ahead.
I will do. Thank you. Sorry about that. I had a technical issue. Thank you. And I'm really excited to be participating in this collection as a documentary filmmaker, because it gave me an opportunity to kind of bring my research into dialogue with the other texts in the volume, and to really kind of try and look at the different areas and different approaches that we're all using. So my article attempted to open what feels like a pretty unresearched terrain, which is that of Yugoslavia's cinematic role in the non-aligned countries. And I decided in this article to focus on one particular institution, which is Filmske Novosti, the Yugoslav newsreels, primarily because they were the only film studio that was directly answerable to the federal government in Yugoslavia. And that really allowed me to kind of trace the political mechanisms that were driving Yugoslavia's cinematic collaborations in non-aligned countries. I'm gonna share my screen just because I work in a visual medium. So hopefully all of you can see this. Basically, the article is the most academic expression, if you like, of a multi-form artistic research project that I've been working on since 2013 in collaboration with Filmske Novosti, which is trying to work through and digitize their collection of materials from non-aligned countries. The kind of core of this research project is a feature-length documentary film about one of the longest working cameramen of Filmske Novosti, called Stevan Lobudovic. But it's also part of a wider research project which was seeking ways to project these images forward. So via critical writing, obviously, but also via video installations, exhibitions, and online content. And actually, in terms of online content, in September 2020, on the anniversary of the Initiative of Five that took place in New York, we actually launched a web platform on which we are beginning to upload materials related to this research and to the digitalization of the materials. So I've kind of I put the website here for you so that you could check it out when you have time. But basically, just to try and briefly summarize, the starting point is obviously the archive collection of Filmske Novosti, and I was kind of working with Walter Benjamin's idea of these images coming up to the surface as debris, for which I've been trying to figure out a parentage and kind of understand the context of their creation, very much treating them as orphan images in many senses, because one, they're in a legal vacuum, their status in terms of rights is unclear. Two, because ideologically they have been orphaned in the sense that they've been written out of the narrative of Serbia, in the same way that Yugoslavia's role in the non-aligned movement has pretty much been written out of current political narratives. But also orphan images because these archives have no sound, which is to say that it is very, very hard sometimes to interpret the context of their creation. And for that reason, in particular, the work that I've been doing, that I did with Stevan Lobudovic, whom I met when he was 87 years old, was really of critical importance because it allowed me to understand, obtain a subjective gaze on the materials that they were filming and the role that the cameramen of Filmske Novosti were playing in all of these countries. Stevan Lobudovic made for a very, very interesting conduit into the story of Yugoslavia's role in the non-aligned movement by mere fact that he had been assigned to travel with President Tito and had thus filmed pretty much all of the central historical events that led to the creation of the non-aligned movement and the summit in Belgrade. So he not only filmed all of Tito's voyages to Africa and Asia in the 1950s, but he was also the cameraman who was filming the Brioni meeting between Tito, Nasser, and Nehru, the cameraman who accompanied President Tito to New York in order to film his first appearance at the United Nations, and hence filmed the Initiative of Five that took place in the Yugoslav mission to the United Nations. And he was also the cameraman who was given the task of making the color film of the first non-aligned summit in Belgrade. And so with Stevan Lobudovic, I spent about 3 years going through the archive of Filmske Novosti, but also going through his personal archives and papers in order to try and understand how he embodies this idea of a transnational scenic kinship that was set up between Yugoslavia and the countries in which the cameraman of Filmske Novosti filmed. Really trying to kind of engage the perspective of the person who had filmed this archive. Where it became incredibly interesting in kind of opening up this idea of Yugoslav internationalism is that Stevan Lobudovic was also the person who was sent by the Yugoslav government, or if you like, President Tito himself, in order to chronicle and film the Algerian Liberation War. And where I felt he really helped me understand and kind of inscribe Yugoslavia into a more internationalist perspective is really this idea that the work that he did in the Algerian War, and this is him filming for the Algerian Liberation Army, was really kind of predecessor to this whole concept of third cinema and kind of a military use for the cinematic image, both in the diplomatic role that it performed by informing the outside world of events that were taking place within the liberation movement struggle, but also by recruiting new supporters and thence being used in an instructional role by the movements themselves. And just to briefly summarize the two strands of the research. So one is this idea of the cinematic documentation and the representation of Tito's role in the birth of the online movement, and this idea of Yugoslav cameramen filming liberation struggles come together at the Belgrade Summit in 1961. And here you see again Stevan Lobudovic filming President Nasser. But the Belgrade Summit really for me was a turning point in the research, because one of the documents that I came across in my research on how the Information Secretariat of the federal government kind of used Filmske Novosti and operationalized their use for political purposes was this report that I found saying that of the 25 countries that participated in the summit, 18 of them didn't have any newsreels of their own. And this is where Yugoslavia's role in the non-aligned cinematic engagements really begins, because following the Belgrade Summit, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview here. They established cinematic collaborations in the form of technical cooperation with many newly emerging countries in Africa, but also they continue to film for and with liberation movements. So starting off with the work Stevan Lobudovic did in Algeria, it also expands to working with Frelimo in Mozambique, and then also notably a documentary film shot again by Stevan Lobudovic for the Palestinian liberation movement in 1970. So just to say as a summary, the work that I've been doing has really been about this idea of using the cinematic image and using film archives to challenge the dominant histories. So one has been obviously the identification and the digitalization of unused rushes that exist still in Filmske Novosti, not only of Tito's voyages, but of the liberation movements that were filmed by Yugoslav cameramen. 2 has been researching the afterlife of these images, but 3 has really been this idea of trying to contextualize the material and establish its parentage. And the article that I wrote for this collection is really concerned with that, actually. And then finally, obviously, there is the idea of not just looking back at the past, but figuring out ways in which the projection of these images will help emancipate the present or give us kind of imaginaries for the future. I think that's maybe the right place to stop.
Great, perfect. Thanks, Mila, for sharing that with us, and also having a visual in a certain way introduction into our talking heads. And as I've already introduced Bojana, I can just give the floor to her, she also looked at kind of cultural diplomacy and art as themes for that non-aligned exchange. So Bojana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. Thank you, Ljubica, Florian, and Mark for organizing this. I hope everybody can hear me. So like Mila, I'm dealing with culture and art and Yugoslavia's role in those sort of global movements towards South-South and Southeast cooperation and culture. The text is a kind of a breakdown of some of my ideas that have developed over the past several years in terms of what I term non-aligned modernism, which is also the title of the article, and it's also part of the research that I've done for my book. So the text proceeds from a materialist base or methodology in which I am interested in infrastructure and collaboration in terms of art and cultural diplomacy. Unlike some of my colleagues in art history, I'm interested in how modernism as a term is built through institutional work and state work, not just through aesthetic work. So the term that I'm using, that I'm interested in, that underlies this article is that culture and art produced through non-aligned modernism is something that comes out of material basis in socialist Yugoslavia. And something that others have noted, the legacy of that art and cultural practices and infrastructure has survived after the end of Yugoslavia. So what I'm arguing as well in terms of materiality is that even the institutions that were not necessarily directly involved in non-aligned cultural production actually benefited. Materially benefited from states' infrastructure built for non-aligned. So I'm interested in the ways in which we can, as Mila has also pointed out, retrace this history that in terms of modern art history has been forgotten, and Yugoslavia's role. So that the ways in which Yugoslavia contributed to both building of political engagements has reflected in building of cultural and artistic engagements. And I'm very interested in ideas that counter hegemony of Western culture, especially through what Vietnamese diplomat Tran Van Ding has called cultural imperialism. And he uses this in the 1960s. And so the work that Yugoslav artists, cultural workers have done was to sort of create an alternative to how modernism, its institutions, and its cultures have been developing in the 20th century. So apart from materialist usage of methodology, I'm also interested in post-colonial view of this in order to say, and in order to argue that non-aligned culture wasn't created after 1945 or even after 1955, but it was actually created much earlier in the 20th century. I'm looking at the ways in which the experiences prior to World War II, during the World War II, were actually informing how cultural workers in Yugoslavia went out and collaborated with others from around the world. And so the rest of the article really looks at a couple of examples. The way that cultural workers in Yugoslavia used UNESCO and its infrastructure to build collaboration, and on the other hand, how they used newly emerging non-aligned cultural networks. Some of it was happening through film, what Mila talks about, but other things were happening through other media and through exhibitions and investment in exhibitionary cultures, which is what I end up talking about. And my one sort of major example was Ljubljana Biennale. That's an exhibition that still exists, and that over its time pragmatically became invested in showcasing East, West, and South. So all of the kind of cultures, global cultures, and became an example of what I term non-aligned modernism. So these products of the transnational collaboration and cooperation were reflected through the state funding, and that state funding into infrastructure is even today used by cultural institutions and individuals. So I'm going to end here, and if there's any questions, I can answer more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bojana. Now we turn to Tvrtko Jakovina, who's a professor of history at the University of Zagreb, and in fact also just recently published a book about the biography of Budimir Lončar, which is called Od preka do vrha svijeta, which was published last year. And we had actually also the opportunity to have Tvrtko talk to Budimir Lončar during our workshop a few years ago. So it's very appropriate that you would be commenting on this collection, having worked on similar topics over the years. So Tvrtko, over to you.
Thank you very much. Lončar is still around. He, believe it or not, still has his own teeth, but there are some problems. So he's currently at the dentist's having small problems, but nothing major. So he turned 97 on April the 1st. And I've been talking a little bit with that because Chiara asked me something about Vida Tomšić. So I do have some info that's not in my biography, but we can maybe talk about that. First of all, there are no bad articles in this volume, and that is excellent. All of these articles are rather long, and there is plenty of information that that really can help anyone dealing with former Yugoslavia, but also, as you said, the global South many times, at many different aspects. Of course, soon I started to read. I first got the urge to listen to Kemal Monteino's anthem of Energo Invest Company, which is on YouTube. It's not one of the best songs of famous Bosnian singer, but it's really worth listening. And I have to say that in the meantime, over the past 5 years, there were several attempts that would perfectly fit in this volume. So for instance, probably equally organized article could be written on the doctors or medical doctors in the third world. Maybe those working in food industry of different kind, architects, musicians. You have two or maybe three professors, first professors, the founding fathers of the Musical Academy in Cairo, who came there already in the 50s and 60s, early 60s when it was founded. I don't know whether should I go maybe article by article or maybe try to combine certain things. I think that what could be good to say at the very beginning, Yugoslav foreign policy became a topic of the masses. When Tito was leaving or going to board, before he was about to board Galeb, you know, there were tens of thousands of people waiting for him or listening to what he has to say, and the same was upon his arrival, as well as what Mila showed when those newsreels were coming to Yugoslavia, showing how he or what they were doing in different countries in Asia and Africa. That was connected with the way I would say how cultural industry or film industry was following the whole thing. So that was the whole experience. What would be probably good to see is how all these politics and these countries were explained to not very educated general population in Yugoslavia. What were the means? Because we didn't have that many movies, and we didn't have that many, not only movies, because many of these countries didn't have, as Mila showed, the industry to show these or to have films from these world, but a population that normally was rather ignorant about the newly founded countries around the world. That would be probably an interesting approach along the line of these articles that were published already here. When we talk about students, it's really amazing that we lack anything dealing with students, or that we have hardly anything dealing with students, especially because there were so many of them and over such a long time, and especially in the light that during the 90s, there were hardly any foreign students studying in any of the Yugoslav countries because of the war and because these countries were not or hardly were connected with the Erasmus program. But you know, now when things are more normal, we still do not know, and we still operate with something that was shown clearly in this article was not the case. Non-alignment was so often criticized for being not fair vis-a-vis Yugoslavia, taking out Yugoslavia of its European context, you know, spending money. While at the same time here, I think that in the on the first page, it's shown that 97% of all students were paying for their studies, not being on scholarships. And that was approximately what I've heard from a man who was director of Međunarodni studentski klub prijateljstva, Međunarodni studentski klub solidarnosti in Zagreb. So that was the club of international students in Zagreb, which had thousands of students. Well, nevertheless, these students were, some of them, politically very active, especially those coming from the Arab countries, and very left-wing, much more left-wing than the Yugoslavs would like them to be. So that was the problem for many of the people taking care of the students in the Yugoslav cities, and also trying to balance how far will they go in their criticism of some of the policies of the Western countries, but also Yugoslavia. it would be also probably good to see, was there any racism in different Yugoslav university cities vis-a-vis foreign students? You know, were they having troubles finding accommodation, especially those who were not living in dormitories, and how general population was oriented vis-a-vis them? There are very few data on that, but it would be probably interesting to see. And also Zamtes and Mr. Rege Page, who was mentioned in the last paragraph of Wright's paper, he came after Mr. Marin Gershkovic, who eventually became Yugoslav ambassador to Georgetown, Guyana, and both of them were a bit more radical than the regular Yugoslav policy. And that was from the very early days onwards. Marin Gershkovic, for instance, whose father was working in Ethiopia and was one of the fathers of Ethiopian constitution. He was founder of Faculty of Political Sciences in Zagreb. Marin Gershkovic, for instance, published an article in 1970 telling or entitled, "Nixon is not our friend." And that was before President Nixon came to Zagreb, Belgrade, and Kumrovec, which is also interesting in a way. But something that could be taken further, but that's another article. I'm not criticizing here anything, simply saying that there were students who achieved a career in Yugoslavia. I'll give you just one example. In 1971, there was one student from Ghana who became a Croatian nationalist at the time of the Croatian Spring, and he was a composer of Ivan Goran Kovacic's song Beli Most, that was performed by Vice Vukov, one of the chief singers of that time, on Krapinski Festival, which is also something that can be maybe mentioned. All of these articles, especially for people who are coming from outside the region, are giving the whole history and the change of institutions. For instance, Chiara, when she's talking about how women organizations were changing names or what they were becoming through history. Or in Milorad Lazic's case, you have a very good overview of different cases where Yugoslavs were selling weapons and doing business or helping, if you wish, with in different parts of the world. Of course, there were more countries than were mentioned here. I will maybe use the opportunity to mention Mr. Rege Page, who was one of the directors of Zamtes, but he was not only in charge of that, he was sometimes in Latin America or in Central America, helping some of the freedom fighters there on Yugoslav behalf. So that is something that we can maybe discuss later. I liked, for instance, in that article, the part on the weapons and the military cooperation, especially in the light of everything that was happening in Portuguese Africa. But we have to be fair. Yugoslavs were never in a position to do what the Cubans were ready to do. You know, so the Yugoslavs were never in a position to send 13,000 soldiers in an operation to Africa anywhere. And that was really problematic for Yugoslavia in general, because the Cubans built a very popular face for themselves, and that created so many problems for the Yugoslavs within the non-aligned in the late 70s, but also pushed Yugoslavia much closer to to the Western side, if you wish, when Americans were rather pleased with the Yugoslav way of handling the conference in Havana. And also Ljubljana Biennale that Bojana mentioned in her presentation, or mentioned several times. I would say that there is still something of that in Ljubljana. The last trip I made out of Croatia during the Corona crisis was in Ljubljana, but they had something in a photo gallery dedicated to a modern photography of Indonesia. And then they organized a lecture on Yugoslavia in Indonesia and the Yugoslavs in that part of Asia, remembering things that Slovenes were doing and inviting artists from Indonesia to do that. Now, I think that it would be good to see what were the reactions of women cooperation and women going to different Asian and African countries. What were the reactions in Yugoslavia? Was that simply a policy of Vida Tomšić or the elite going to somewhere, or they were doing something concrete or trying to help, or maybe referring in different ways in Yugoslavia itself? The same goes for the artists. I think that many of them use that as a possibility to earn something, to be present. Many of them were going to Ethiopia. They were probably interested in many different ways, but that was the place where you could sell certain things and earn money. Many of the Croatian painters were doing that. I would presume that many of the others were doing that. Augustinčić was also interested from that point of view. So what Ljubica and Anna wrote, that you have that entrepreneurial spirit in spite of self-management, I think that was visible in so many different fields, including the artists and definitely the military. And I wouldn't say that was only the case for the younger officers who were in charge in the 80s. In the 80s, one of the very visible events when Yugoslavs simply did a break with its previous practice was the beginning of the war between Iraq and Iran. The Yugoslavs for the first time did not condemn the aggressor, although Iraqis were the aggressor on Iran, because of our military interests there and possibility to sell weapons to the Iraqi side. And that was just one thing. There were 13,000 Yugoslav workers in Iraq doing different things or building different kind of buildings, not only military installations. So that's important, and I think that Anna and Ljubica show that, that when Energo Invest was searching for people to make a transition or transform their company to fit better to the international market, and that was very early, actually, they were not so dissimilar than many other walks of life vis-a-vis the global south. Energo Invest is also a Bosnian story that shows something that seems almost impossible today. It is, I spoke with some of the managers of that company who said, well, do not compare Končar or companies that existed before the war. There was a small Siemens factory in Zagreb, so Končar was built on the Siemens small factory. In Sarajevo, we didn't have anything, zero. And then we managed to build a company that was absolutely unbelievable, doing so many different things, educating people, thanks to one very capable guy, and people around him who obviously believed him. And that was just one company, this one from Bosnia, and that's what makes it interesting. But also there were companies in Serbia like that, and in other republics. So in the light of everything that's going on in the region today, and I mean all walks of life now, that all sounds or looks simply unbelievable. You know, Chiara writes, and I made a short research about Madam Ferencic, who was working in Santo Domingo for the UN agency. You know, we have a constitutional court today and that ordered our government to refresh our law on reproduction and abortion and so on. And the government has no courage to do anything for many years already, you know, although it was an order by the court, you know. And then in the 70s and 80s, the Yugoslavs had experts working in the different UN agencies being so progressive. The same goes for not only military more or less. We have maybe some doing something, but I mean, I can quote that or say that Croatia finally decided to buy airplanes, but a couple of years ago, we were not even able to buy airplanes, you know, that failed. And during the Cold War, we were producing airplane and selling airplanes to Zambia and Libya. And those pilots were coming to different parts of Yugoslavia. That's shown in the article. You also have, he recently died, Mr. Rendulic, who wrote a book on his former chief of staff of Yugoslav Air Force. So all these things look so so different, you know. 7,000 students, or I don't know, in 1977, when 1,000 Nigerians came to Yugoslavia, different parts of Yugoslavia. All this sounds almost impossible today, or hard to imagine today in any of the Yugoslav states. So this is going to be a very useful volume. Very even articles. So whoever was doing the editing did a very good job, I would say. And I'm really very pleased. There are those things that we could maybe add in some of the future volumes, but otherwise, you know, this is something that's going to help many of us. And I will finish with an invitation to the people I can see on this screen, or the people that are on the other screen. There are going to be several events in Belgrade this year commemorating the anniversary of the Belgrade Conference. We are trying to do something similar next year in Zagreb and Rijeka, because Galeb will be in Rijeka Harbor by the end of this summer, and then we hope that the whole museum will be there open 1 year from now, or less than a year from now. So University of Zagreb and University of Rijeka will try to do something. You will get the invitation letter and see what we have in mind. So please, if you planning to travel somewhere, we will organize also a visit to Vanga on Brioni, which belongs to the state protocol. So whoever wasn't there, that might be the chance. Although that's not going to be part of the conference, but we will open it for you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tvrtko, for both pointing out research venues for further work. And I think we surely didn't think of this as the exhaustive and final, but rather as one way of exploring these topics, but also taking us to Brioni, at least in our thoughts, which of course is always a nice idea. So I would like to open up at this point for questions you have. We have roughly 20 minutes for any questions any of you have. So you can just raise your hand, and we have Brigitte Lenormand who has a question in the chat, and I'll just briefly put that out there, but please raise your hand if you have any other questions. She's asking about the, whether or not focusing on Yugoslavia in the non-aligned story reproduces kind of disbalances and focuses on Yugoslavia and the agency, and undermines or downplays the agency of other partners in the non-aligned movement, and how to deal with this particular problem. So it's not like saying one shouldn't put Yugoslavia at the center, but how do you avoid then kind of ignoring or marginalizing other countries in the global south in this story. And that's, I guess, a question which applies to everybody, because all of the studies, of course, focus on Yugoslavia. Bojana, do you want to say something to that? Did I interpret your hand signal right? And then you can kick us off. And in the meantime, maybe one of the other audience members gets the courage to ask a question.
Yeah, I would like to respond to this, because this is a very common question that I've received at every single presentation about non-aligned modernism. For example, in my own case, I'm coming at it because I'm Yugoslav, because I was born in socialism, because I was born in the non-alignment, and my own research, being diasporic and being a minority researcher, both in terms of my ethnicity, but also in terms of my research interests, being in Western academia, I can see how absolutely marginalized this discourse is. So the fact that we have a space to even talk about Yugoslavia in this way is absolutely and enormously important, because in the last 30 years, this has been systematically ignored or revised. So there is a very important reason for doing this. That's number one. And it's a political reason. So in my own, this again, I'm speaking to in my own case. This is not something, this research that I'm producing is not something that uses Yugoslavia as a study, an object of study, but it actually uses it to showcase the potential for political, aesthetic, and artistic and other kinds of organizing for the future. So there's a political goal behind it. So in fact, it is because of my research that I've made connections to colleagues from around the world, colleagues who work on India, colleagues who work on Indonesia, on other parts in Egypt. And this is how we create solidarities. So I'm not ignoring them. I'm just working in collaboration, in solidarity, where we all come from our own backgrounds, our own places where we politically, aesthetically, and otherwise grew up, and make work in solidarity. So I don't think that making this case for Yugoslavia and putting it in its rightful position is ignoring, marginalizing it, or taking away from any other non-aligned country. It's simply placing it after 25 years of complete ignoring. It's placing it in its context, which should be done. And hopefully, and this is where things are going, both in my own research and I know in the research of the colleagues who are sitting here, we are moving on in solidarity with those from other non-aligned countries who are doing the same kinds of research from their positionality.
Great, thanks a lot, Bojana. Does anybody else want to chip in to that question? Yes, Chiara, go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's a very legitimate question from Brigitte, and I think definitely the inputs coming from post-colonial feminism are something that's present in my work, and that's something that I keep in mind. On the other hand, it's true that this connection between South and East has been neglected, as Bojana was mentioning, and especially this what is the role of global socialist feminism and global socialist internationalism, especially at the level of women's activism, is something that is very overlooked. So to put this center stage doesn't mean that we're not taking into account post-colonial and Black feminist lessons. On the other hand, it's important to look at the role of socialist internationalism there as well, I would say, and that's something I try to do. And I don't think that putting, in this case, Yugoslavia at the center is marginalizing other women. On the contrary, maybe through this lens we can discover some connections that are neglected even at the level of the global south. And I think it would be very, very interesting if we could have some collaborative projects, of course, with Indian scholars or scholars from other former non-aligned countries that could research their own hand and their own archives. Of course, this is a limit there in terms of what we can do in terms of language as well. So that's something that would definitely be a next step, I would say.
Great, thanks, Chiara. There's a question from Francesca Rolandi, who's asking also about what was the impact of the non-aligned movement on Yugoslavia's position in the United Nations. And I see, Ljubica, you wanna say something to that?
Yeah, not necessarily maybe on the position, but I forgot to mention in my introduction that, of course, we also pointed out in the special issue introduction the centrality of the UN, right, both for non-alignment, but also how it appears in most of the articles, in fact. So Bojana and several others mentioned UNESCO, Peter, right, Anna and I talked about the UNDP and developmental paradigms and policies that affected very much also the thinking around the public enterprise, and not least that the center, the International Center for Public Enterprises in Developing Countries, which was functioning under UN auspices, was based in Ljubljana, in Yugoslavia. Chiara talked about the UN Decade for Women, and Milorad perhaps didn't mention, but he mentioned also the UN peacekeeping forces in Egypt that Yugoslavia was taking part of. So I think the UN played a huge central role for the non-aligned movement. Mila mentioned the summit and the the Yugoslav mission in New York, which hosted a lot of these meetings, of course. But because the movement did not have its secretariat, right, its permanent seat, they used the UN for a lot of these initiatives, not least the new international economic order and all these debates around equitable trade and development also in the 1970s. So they used the UN infrastructure also to their own end. But feel free to add to that as well.
Thanks, thanks, Ljubica. I mean, I would like to put in a specific, because there's a specific question by Leon de Parot about for Milorad Lazic, which is about the reference to the partisan kind of legacy in the support for liberation movements and newly independent states, and he's asking whether this reference to the partisan generation was part of the kind of public face of this support, in a certain way, the public narrative, or whether this was something more of the internal, kind of self-understanding. So was this the way to justify the support, or was this really something which drove this kind of support for liberation movements and independent states? So Milorad, maybe you want to pick up on that question.
Thank you so much, Leo, for this very good question. As a historian, I would say, well, it was a little bit of both, and I'll elaborate further on that point. Unfortunately, I did not have access to any internal records of expert enterprises, and I don't know if those records exist, but you can find, like some partial documents here and there in different archives and record groups in archives of Yugoslavia and like these regional archives in Croatia, Slovenia, or Serbia. Why I say a little bit of both. It is a very prominent feature. For example, when they provide, and this is something also can be tied to this question of foreign students. When they bring, like, for example, members of military movements to Yugoslavia for army training. One part of that army training is actually very important part is they're show, for example, these places, canonical places of Yugoslav liberation struggle. They go and visit Sutjeska, or they go and visit, like different sort of monuments. They're provided literature on Yugoslav war. My most recent project, as Tvrtko mentioned, as a very nice avenue of research I'm doing about Yugoslav medical missions in Africa. Integral part of training, for example, of doctors or medical personnel in Africa when they bring them to Yugoslavia is to show them this very strong legacy of partisan hospitals and show them how this experience of partisan hospitals in World War II can be applied to their combat conditions. So there's this, like undeniable link between these experiences in World War II and this identification how Yugoslav revolutionary experience can be transplanted abroad. Other part of that question, it really requires sometimes a very close reading of these documents and, like a personal testimonies where, for example, discussing the assistance to Algerian War of Independence, something that Mila mentioned. They talk in very vivid terms, like they talk about, like Algerian partisans, and they say, well, they're just like us, meaning they're fighting against, like domestic reactionary forces and against foreign occupation. And there's this, like a very clear link between those historical experiences and the way how these policies were shaped in that way. So yes, I would say that there was a way to they advertised and build this image of Yugoslav branded know-how. They said, look, our revolution, our liberation struggle was successful. Yours can be too, if you follow, like these steps, or like apply some of these practices. And they go there and they, my recent research was about Guinea-Bissau, where they say, hey, Amilcar Cabral, he's this, like a very good revolutionary. He's even trying to emulate our, regional, like local liberation councils, like we did in 1941. So that means his revolution is good one. So we should help it. And I'll stop here. So my answer is yes. There was this, like a conscious attempt to connect these historic experience and practices with liberation struggles.
Great, thanks, Milorad. And we have Paul Stubbs who would like to ask a question. So Paul, why didn't you just come in and?
Yeah, thanks. So great, congratulations everybody. And the question's easy, but the context might be a bit more difficult. The question is where next? And the context is that it's really fortuitous that this launch is the same day that Bojana, Chiara, Mila, Tvrtko and I and lots of other people handed in an edited volume on the same topic that will be published next year. So it would be good to see now there really is this critical mass of researchers, activists, artists working on these questions, where next? And for me, I mean, I guess there are two suggestions. One is this whole issue of the relationship between non-alignment, transcontinentalism and Bandung, but also kind of, world regionalism, Pan-Africanism, negritude, Pan-Arabism. And the other, which I think Chiara kind of forced me into thinking about, is around socialist internationalism and a non-Eurocentric view of socialist internationalism and the contradictions even within Yugoslavia of that kind of strong ideologization at home and a strong de-ideologization within Yugoslavia's liminal hegemony of the non-aligned movement. So I'm really just throwing it open as to what people are kind of thinking of working on in the future, really.
Great, Paul. I think that's actually an excellent way to have a final round for everybody to chip in and say where to take it from here. What's next? So I would say we're going to just follow the order we had our presentations and maybe go start with Ljubica as a final word and where next?
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Excellent question. Well, there are many potential venues, and I think Tvrtko clearly outlined, and I think there is a huge interest, and I know that there also was a recent conference on guerrilla movements and this transnational also medical experiences of guerrilla movements, so very much what Milorad mentioned. I'm very much interested in still tracing this long-term history of internationalism, so I've been looking at pre-formal non-aligned links. So Palestine is very much in the news today. So I've been recently looking at the UN Special Committee on Palestine in 47-48, where indeed Yugoslavia and India were the ones who proposed the federal, who put up the federal proposal, right, as opposed to the two-state solution proposal. So I would like to trace back in a way a lot of these links, and even go into the interwar period for my second book project.
Great. Thanks, Ljubica. I would first give the floor to Tvrtko, because I know he has to run for a class, to give a last chance to outline where he's going next with or taking these topics.
Something could. I will, Dominique Ryle is waiting for me there with my PhD students. I will probably work on, contacts with Yugoslavia and Yugoslavs with the global South before the Second World War. And also it will be connected with Galeb, which I'm working together with people from Rijeka. So that's what I will do. Unfortunately, I'll stop here, and I'll recommend it to all of the people who didn't have a chance. Well, yes, of course, neutral and non-aligned. So there were several issues published on neutrality together with the non-aligned countries. So that is what Paul mentioned. That is also one of the possible vistas for research, although certain things have been covered. Great. And recommendation to all of you who didn't have a chance to read it yet, of course.
Great. Thank you very much, Tvrtko. Say hi to Dominique Ryle and the excellent book she's going to be presenting in your class, I presume. So thanks for joining us here despite the tight schedule. So let's hear it from James, because you were also kind of putting it into the larger context, where to take this next.
I mean, I think the suggestions so far have been excellent. There's many different ways to do it. One way I'm thinking about it at the moment is through the questions of race, which we haven't much discussed today. And so I'm getting together a volume with a number of collaborators on race and whiteness in Eastern Europe. And I think that can be usefully brought into conversation with questions of anti-colonialism and of course periods before and after it, but how far anti-colonialism itself was also tied up with ideas of European whiteness rather than necessarily the rejection of them. So I think that's an interesting area for future scholarship.
Great, thanks a lot. Next, we're going to have Chiara.
Thank you, Florian. Yeah, just for childcare reasons, I'm going before the others, so to skip the queue. So yeah, at the moment I would like to work for my second book on a transnational biography of Vida Tomšić. So thanks to a research assistant, I've been collecting a number of archive materials, again, from that enormous archive. Ljubica was there with me in 2015. So I hope to be working on this in the summer and to continue into next year and to really highlight all this transnational connection, not just between Vida Tomšić and other activists, but also between these Yugoslav women's organizations and other women's organizations, so the organizational level, but also the biographical level.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chiara. So Anna, we're back to the order.
Thank you. I think what's interesting for me is what Paul was mentioning and about unpacking socialist internationalism, and specifically the question of dependency and economic self-reliance is important to me, and I would like to explore it further, taking it into the 1990s and the 2000s and looking at how these non-aligned connections actually built different avenues into South-South cooperation through transnational, multinational companies starting from the South and kind of questioning this Western global order or not. And currently, actually, I'm working quite hard on an article on Yugoslav-Cuban relations and also taking them into the later period with Serbia as a kind of hair of this connections. So that might be also a different avenue for me. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Anna. Milorad, what's up? What's next for you, or what should one do next?
Sure. That's a tough question. So I am working right now, kind of exploring this idea of Yugoslav medical missions in Africa, especially that were associated with these liberation movements. It's kind of like outgrowing my research on Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. So now I'm kind of going into that direction. I'm not sure where I'm going to arrive, but exploring this concept of socialist modernism through, like these medical missions, how that played out in Africa as a integral part of this decolonization struggle. I'll keep posted about any advancements in that field.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Milorad. Peter.
Thank you. So like Milorad, I'm actually also working on Yugoslav healthcare internationalism. And specifically, I'm expanding a chapter of my dissertation on the WHO's initiative Healthcare for All and activism from the Global South in the WHO. And so linkages between the WHO and non-alignment and Yugoslav healthcare internationalism, which also includes questions about, I know Anna and Milorad are actually asking questions like this about Yugoslav pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical companies and so forth. But I'm also interested in the question of race and racism. And I just completed a manuscript that hopefully will appear soon about conversations in Yugoslavia about racism. This questions, the larger political questions that accusations or allegations of racism raises for Yugoslavia and its non-aligned partners. So that's what I'm working on.
Great, thanks. Mila.
So as you can see behind me, the next step is finishing editing the film. And I'm also working on a series of video installations I was commissioned by the Museum of the City of Rijeka for the Galeb exhibition. So I captured testimonies of the crew that had traveled with Tito on the Voyages of Peace and just trying to make my way through all the material. But where I really, what Bojana said about using all this research as a way of political organizing for the future really resonates with me. So for me, it's really been about how to take these images back to the countries where they were filmed and particularly present them to a younger generation. And so I've partnered with the Tricontinental Institute run by Vijay Prashad, and we're trying to organize a screening of these archives at the United Nations for the General Assembly, and then figure out ways to build partnerships. At the moment, we've done it in Ghana and Ethiopia, Algeria, and Mozambique in order to organize screenings locally and invite artists and practitioners to kind of interact and work with these images.
Great. That also answers the question about how to, avoid the kind of Yugoslav centrism in this whole, bring it back and show it also in the countries where the Yugoslav documentaries were made. So Bojana, last thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up there.
Something that I've started thinking about in my book is this idea that, number one, we need to link non-aligned to the partisan struggle in World War II, and more importantly, to pre-World War II struggles. And even before that, to the 19th century struggles, histories of Bosnia, Macedonia, Kosovo, and others who were colonized, others who were semi-colonized. So my next book is going back into pre-World War II, into some of those artistic practices that informed what happened after. But I'm also interested in thinking about what others have mentioned, race that has been a hot topic, but also through a kind of what Field Sisters have criticized is the whiteness studies and their critique of whiteness studies, for example, as well as a few other articles and studies that have been problematizing some of the ways in which race has been perceived outside of the United States context. So thinking long-term and thinking about these questions around Yugoslavia and the NAM in a kind of long durée.
Great, thank you, Bojana. We're a bit over time, but I think this was a good tour de table, so to speak, in the end, to think about where to go from here. And as you can all hear, thank you for joining us. There is much more to be researched and new venues to be explored. So thanks to all of the participants for their great articles and their contributions and joining us today. And I think I can say on behalf of James and Ljubica, thank you to all of you. And if you're interested, you can listen and see the presentation online on YouTube, as well as read the articles, of course. So thanks to everybody and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.